Good now? Okay. This is where I wanted to pick up where we left off last week. Um, this week is really going to be the almost the end of First Samuel and the beginning of Second Samuel. It's going to kind of run into that piece. This is not so much on the military side. It's just there's a lot going on, and you can't pass it up. You can't not talk about David. And like I said, we've been going over David and his character, and you just can't think about David and not think about these passages, especially at the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel. With the end of Saul and the beginning of David as king, that's kind of where we're going to live today. It was really funny. Well, it was funny to me, but Colin, little Colin was asking me. He saw me kind of going through it, and he was asking me about it, and he was like, David. And then he was like, what are you talking about with David? And like it clicked to me right as he said it. I was like, honestly, bud, like this week is all about like the many faces of David. Like it clicked to me. It was kind of one of the weird things that I saw because there's so many different sides of David you see when he first starts to, right before he's king to when he first starts taking over king. And that's really where we're going to be today. David fleeing. So in 1 Samuel 27:1, we're going to go into, I'll pull that one up. If somebody would like to help read today, there's a lot of reading, but I'll do the first one. 1 Samuel 27, verse 1. So then David said in his heart, now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me and any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. I think that's something that I've read before, and I kind of overlooked, but when I try to put myself in David's situation and David's predicament he's in, it would have been easy to think that David knows that he's the chosen one. David knows that he's the anointed. He's the man after God's own heart, and him try to stay and fight, but I saw the humbleness here when I looked at it, the humbleness of fleeing. However, I was reading other Bible studies on David, and there's a lot of people who don't see it that way. They see it as this was David's one of his big negatives. One of his biggest sins was fleeing, was running from Saul. He ran to his enemies. He ran away from Israel and ran into the Philistines. It was just something that was interesting to me. I don't know. What are the thoughts? Because I've read multiple things on this. It's just one of those things that I always saw that as a humble moment where he fled. He was a great warrior. He's won many battles. So to me, it was just one of those times. Yes, sir.
Well, God does not condemn him for doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're the comments are fast and right there. Yeah.
Well, like in last week, you got brought up that he wouldn't kill Saul. Mm-hmm. So if you're not going to kill Saul because he's the Lord's anointed, and Saul wants to kill you, then you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
I mean, so if he's got to keep running because he won't fight Saul, and so he's constantly running, and it's. Sometimes, we think it's just like David and his two buddies, and they're out running. But this is a whole lot of people that are, and they're constantly having to hide and run. And so I think he's saying, look, I can't fight him, so I might as well leave. He will stop looking for me, and he will turn back to running the kingdom.
Hmm? Yes, ma'am.
David was really strategic, though. I mean, that's why he was a good leader. When he went to the Philistines, he purposely said, we're not worthy to live in your big city, Achish. And so they were set outside the city, which gave him kind of autonomous rule of his own group. And therefore, they were attacking the very tribes that Israel were told to attack and get rid of when they were first given the land. In addition, then later on, when he goes up with Achish, when they call for battle against Israel, he's able to turn the tables. God sends him away. So whether he did it on purpose or whether, he kind of had a feeble moment, God still always is able to make good from bad and was able to turn around and use him against the enemies and later on to help kind of rescue him out of that battle with Israel that was coming.
Yeah, no, that's because I read it, and I guess I read it all the way through, and then thinking about it, like you were saying, he was able to use that time, even if David, like I didn't see it, I really didn't, and I read through it a couple times. I read through the whole 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and then I read that what one man's notes are, and I can bring them up. I could show you guys if you want what his notes were on. That was a weak point in David, and then I read it through again. And I was like, I see that as just a moment where he had no other choice, or maybe he did, and he could have stayed and fought, but he made the decision. He fled, and then I also thought that he's not alone. He has other people with him. He was thinking about them as well. That was where my head went with it, and I was just interested because I just wanted to hear where other thoughts were with it. And then you see 1 Samuel 27, 8 through 12. So this is when David fights with, I practiced these names many times. I did the little Google thing as well to try to use it. The Jeshurites, the Gizites, and the Amalekites. I had no idea how great I did, but I practiced those names multiple times. I got the thumbs up in the back. Maybe I did okay. Does somebody want to read that? 1 Samuel 27, 8 through 12.
Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. From ancient times these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against Negev of Judah, or against Negev of Jerahmeel, or against Negev of the Kenites." He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice as long as he lived in the Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become obnoxious to his people, to the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life."
Yeah, and that's and we kind of already alluded to that and talked about that piece. God is still using him. God is still using him. He's still fighting against the enemies of Israel. I think about Achish in that like I think it's Achish. I think about him in that moment where when he receives David, he takes David and he's thinking like we have a common enemy now, and now I can use this man. This is a tool that's going to be used on our side. And you see how God is, like we talked about, how God is taking David. David fled, he went to the Philistines. God is taking David, and then he's still using him. He's still making him win the battles and fight the battles for Israel. I couldn't pass over that. Wartime scholars, you cannot, I looked and I tried to see if there's a spot for it. We talked about iron in the first week. Wartime scholars think that King David possibly learned to use iron during this time. He learned how to melt it, how to use that, how to weaponize it, and use it. And we don't know if it's true or not. It's just something that was brought up that I thought about. It's worth mentioning because we talked a lot about iron and the Philistines using it in the first week, that this possibly could have been the time that David, we don't know that for a fact, but it would make sense that if they're using it and he's fighting with them, he would have possibly learned something about the iron during that time. Any other comments on this piece? It's a good drill. Yeah, oh yeah.
Conflicts me because in the Bible it teaches us thou should not kill, and if you go back to the Old Testament, that's all you read about is David, leaving no one alive. Mm-hmm. And ever since I've been a young child, I've always been so conflicted. Like the Bible teaches, thou should not kill, but yes, he's actually sanctioning a David to go and just murder people. So could somebody please explain? I mean, I've been having this confliction my whole life. Please, somebody explain how does that work? Thou should not kill, but it's okay to go and kill the. I mean, could somebody explain that to me?
This is, yeah. Whew. Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Is it Mitch?
No. I
No, but the reason why, God told him, to annihilate them was because if they brought them in, they were going to corrupt their society. And so that's why they told him not to marry them. That's what they told him, you capture a city and you kill everybody because you bring them in, they're going to corrupt they're going to bring their gods. They're going to bring, their corruption.
Yeah.
So.
No. There's a lot of comments. It's good. It's good.
Well, God has said, given David permission, and 600 of his men are with him. So I understand that's a very good question. How? Well, I have to leave it at that. Sorry.
No, I really like this question because it pops into my head a lot.
So I think it's important to remember that the Bible didn't say thou shalt not kill. He told the Jews, thou shalt not murder. And murder is a very specific offense. And I know it feels like I'm nitpicking, but war is not murder in God's mind, in David's mind. So in David's mind, he was battling because he was told to battle. And there's a distinction. Maybe not a good enough. Kill is the English word that we put on the Hebrew word for murder. Right. Right, but that's our interpretation of the Hebrew, and that's, not what God put down.
Mark had one too. We got.
The pattern that I recognize in the Old Testament is that when the nation's iniquity is full, God's done with them and he punishes them, including Israel, right? So if the Amalekites or whoever it is, these people sacrifice their children to whatever God, in the name of whatever idol they worship, their iniquity was full. And so over and over you'll see this, I believe you'll see this pattern. God's done with them, and he sends in somebody to take care of it.
So, I mean, God is all how he didn't need us to kill people. Why did he do it? Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
why did he? I mean,
Testing David's faith in following what he did.
Yeah, look at Abraham.
We've got.
Hold on. We got Mark first.
We got a mic there, a mic here. No, so I don't know who has the mic. Go ahead.
So I was going to help this out. Like Ryan, I was a veteran. I was a fighter pilot, and there are people in this world that don't have a moral compass. We're watching it right now. The history says we have that. In the 40s, if we had not acted, would we be here today? Probably not. When you take on a job like we've taken on, there is an ethical side to it. Let me give you an example of it. If you go out and you are coordinating a flight out into the Gulf of Mexico to intercept a drug person flying drugs in, you're not allowed to shoot that airplane down. That's called murder, okay? And you are coached that way. This is today. This is how we deal with it. Now, if somebody attacks America, Ryan and I are expected to go defend America. Will somebody get killed? Most likely. Could it be us? It could be. It's what we accept. So there are I'm with Jim as well. The original Hebrew is murder. Okay, so sometimes we get Bible. This is the danger when we get Bibles that are interpreted, and other people interpret them. Go look yourself. It is murder. That's what the Hebrew says. So that's I'm jumping on board with that. But what I wanted to do was bring it into a context where you defending yourself is one thing. Defending what you're attempting other people is one thing. And you accept when you take on his job or the job I had that unfortunately is part of it. You also understand you could be the victim of that too. So you're right. You live, it's a challenge, you know. How do you work with it? Christ extends his grace. Christ loves us. God sets aside for us to be seated with him. But not everybody believes this. And that's just the cold, hard fact, gang, of what goes on in the world. And I just wanted to talk about that just a little bit and put that on here.
My take on this is that, number one, God's ways are greater than ours, and his thoughts are higher than ours. So we don't understand why God does what he does in many, many ways. The defense of the faith was the basis of the Crusades. Those were the soldiers of the cross. They believed in their own minds, and they slaughtered thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. I don't know. I don't know if there's ever been. I'm sure there's not an accurate count, but in the name of Jesus, whether that was, and they were absolutely committed. But I repeat, God's ways are higher than our ways. Saul later did what God did not order by not exterminating an entire city, and he was punished for it. He lost. Well, he was going to lose the kingship anyway, the reign. But it's important that we not take upon ourselves an understanding of why God does what God does, or why he did what he did, because our rationale doesn't work. Yeah, it's terrible. The Old Testament is bloody. It doesn't sound like a merciful God at all.
Steve?
I think it was Roger that brought up last week that, I think God is even having to deal with this same situation, not in this, as Mike pointed out, not in the same way that we think about it, because he's God and we're not. But David was not allowed to build the temple, and it's because, and it's directly because of maybe not this passage right here, but from the culmination of several passages like this. He said, "You're a warrior," and that I think God had a purpose for David, and his purpose was to do certain things that perhaps we don't understand, but other things that he wasn't allowed to do because his personality and his skill set was not who God wanted to be building a temple for him.
No, just I agree with what's been said, and also you look at the circumstances here. David had a chance to kill Saul multiple times, and he had specifically told his men not to. I mean, how many times do you think his men are like, hey, we've got him, this is our enemy, this is the person pursuing us, we can do this, and suddenly some random guy comes in and just says, yeah, I did this. I can't speak from a military standpoint, but I can speak from a management standpoint. But Sometimes you make examples. Now, I'd say that killing the person is kind of a big example, but he lied to begin with. Ananias and Sapphira, they lied. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but sometimes you also have to look at this based off of circumstances instead of the whole entire big picture of kill versus murder and everything else.
So, I wish I would have had you all about 10 years ago, because that question, like I always thought, like I know my thoughts and my stance on it, but then when I was faced with one of my Marines coming to me after he just killed a man, it was rough for me because I was like, oh, I got this. I can handle this one. I'm a Christian. I can handle this one. And I went and sat down with him, and I did not do well. I did not do well at all. It's hard. I was trying to look it up. I will have it, and I will give it to you. I have a lesson. It's not one I created. It's one that we're given. That's on that, and wartime and scriptures and things like that can help. It's not great, but it did a lot for me, and it did a lot for that young man.
Is it on? Okay. My dad was he was a minister for years and years, and my dad was a veteran of World War II. He's seen a lot of death, and he had a hard time explaining it. Because I used to ask him, Dad, how could you kill? And as the Bible said, thou shalt not kill. He said, well, when somebody is shooting at you, it makes it a little bit easier. That's how he kind of explained it to me. But he says otherwise he would never kill anybody. So I guess if you're defending your, yourself, your life, family, I guess, that makes it okay.
It's hard.
Killing is killing. I don't care how you put it.
There's a lot. When you think about, and that's like so many times when I look at David and I think of the things that he's done and the men he's been with and the impact he had and the different faces and all of that, but that's a hard one. That face is a hard one. And it's, you think that, you're like, oh, okay, like I have the scriptures and I have the justification. It's still really hard. And it's a battle a lot of people don't get over.
I think that's probably why my father was so faithful, because he was trying to find some kind of a redemption for the things he had done, the war. I think that's why he was so faithful.
Yeah. Well,
one of the takeaways that I get from the Old Testament in general, big picture, God takes sin very seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll go into the part with David in the temple in next week, but that one affects a lot of, well, I don't say a lot. It really affects me, because that's scary when you think like he did all these things in the name of God and then he was not able to build the temple. It's a scary thought, because you'd like to think that there's like, war is not what you think it is, and you think like you're good and you got bad and you got this, and like there was clear justification and you had you were absolutely condoned. Well, it's a really, really gray area, and the fact of the lucky ones who have, and I don't want to say lucky, but the luckier ones who have a guy who's aiming at them, shooting at them, that one might be easier. But when you're in a tower and they don't even know you're there and you're 1,000 meters away, there's murkiness, and it gets hard, and it's not easy for a lot of people. But the study of David and the study of the warriors, and up 30,000 feet doing it would be even worse. The study of David and the study of the things that he's done and how God used him, there's a lot of Bible studies in war. I've been to a lot of Bible studies in Iraq, and they help a lot of young men and women. And David is commonly mentioned in those Bible studies, some of the things that he did. But we'll get into it, like I said, next week. David and not being able to build the temple, that hurts. It hurts a lot. I've had that question asked me multiple times, and I really wish I could have brought you all. So as soon as the question was asked, I was like, I would really like to hear, because I kind of have the same question from time to time. And that's like, I really wish I could have taken some of the things that you guys said and been able to bring it to some of those young men, because and I even still might just reach out to them, because there's a lot of people that could use to hear it. So that's good. I appreciated the question. As soon as you said it, I was very, very happy to hear it. I was like, it didn't come from me. Like it's. I love it. I appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. Pushing, and we're still kind of going right in line with it too, because now we're going into Saul's death, and so it says up there, like, Saul's death and David's passion. Can somebody read? It's in 1 Samuel 31, 3 through 8. This is the death of Saul.
I can read.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it, so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and his troops all died together that same day. When the Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley, beyond the Jordan, saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa.
Okay, and then I'll go to the next one. We can go straight to the next one. It's 2 Samuel 1, verses 1 through 10. So after the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The young man told him, and the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." So before we go into David's reaction of that, so we see at the end of 1 Samuel, we see that Saul's dying. He's asking his aide to, I'm forgetting the name of it now, the title, armor bearer. He's asking his armor bearer to end his life, and his armor bearer wouldn't do it. But then we go to 2 Samuel, the first verses, and the Amalekite said that he went there and he finished it. I would love to hear the thoughts on that. Like, what? So he's lying. Like, that was my thought, and I didn't know. I was like, maybe he did fall on his own sword, and maybe there was still some life left in him, and then Amalekite. But we didn't get any mention of that in the beginning of 1 Samuel. Yep. Yeah, and that's I. You can just see this. I mean, and he comes with this clothes torn and sad, and you can just see that. But he's, yeah. I come in and I finished the job. I did it though. Like your enemy is gone. You could just see just trying to get this reward, and see good favor in the eyes of David. It's just one that you can see the setup for the fall that's about to happen. And now again, you're going to see another face of David, because as soon as that ends, and then he says, then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of Sojourner and Amalekite." David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called out one of the young men and said, "Go execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." And you know, David, I mean, he has such high respect for Saul, and you know that he had a very close relationship with Jonathan. Like they were really close. And you just see this messenger coming in, bringing the crown, and thinking, I'm going to get in good favor of David. This is David's enemy, not truly understanding David had multiple opportunities to kill Saul himself, and he didn't. But then you see that face of David that's just, I mean, no hesitation in executing the young man who brought the news.
I think it's notable that an Amalekite recognized that David's the real leader of the people.
Yeah. Why? Why is the Amalekite notable?
Being a foreigner, even he could see that David's the leader. That's the gist of it.
But also the Amalekites that God had said, go and wipe everything out, women, children, donkeys,
Yeah.
everything. Go wipe them
Yeah.
out. Totally. Don't leave a single one left. And here's suddenly the guy saying, yeah, I killed King Saul.
Yeah, that was I didn't catch that till the second read. The second read, going over it a second time. I've never agreed with it. My wife reads something and then she reads it again the second time. I'm like, that's just a waste of time. I'm a huge believer now. Like I will read everything twice, and then sometimes I will never tell her this, but she watches the recording, so she'll probably know. I'll go back a third time now and read it, because I didn't catch that. And then I read it the second time, and I was like, wait a minute. I went back a third time, then went back to the beginning of First Samuel, and I was like, isn't that interesting? It's interesting how that worked. Okay, and then this one, we're going from chapter 1 in Samuel, or in 2 Samuel, to we're going to chapter 4, but it groups in together. I'm going to say this, Ishbosheth. I didn't say that right. I practiced that. Say it. Ishbosheth. Will you read? Will you read 2 Samuel 7 through 10? You say it well. I practiced these, and I still don't have them.
So
2 Samuel 4, 7 through 10.
4, 7 through 10.
Yep. Yes, please.
I'm old school today. They had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Is that right? Okay. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head, taking it with them. They traveled all night by way of the Arabah, or whatever.
You want me to start in 4?
Yes.
Oh.
Yep, chapter 4. Oh.
I thought 7 through 10.
You're doing great. You're doing good.
All right. Sounds good. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, Here's the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring. David answered Rechab and his brother Benaiah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of all trouble, when a man told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?
There you go. There's a lot of death going on, and this is from a man, David, who we just talked about, has killed hundreds, right? Many times now, many battles, has killed hundreds, and now the man who brings the news, and we reading it over and over, one was lying, saying that, oh, I killed your enemy, the king, like your enemy, and then David puts him to execute him, and then you go down, and now one of Saul's sons is put to death, and he's killed. I mean, he's murdered. He's brutally murdered, and then David gives them the same reward that he gave the first time. Yes, sir.
One of the things that was required of the Israelites, if there was a son who was disobedient and would not change, they put him in the middle of the town square and they threw rocks at him until he was dead. Yeah. And that was from maybe you're out there outside the circle watching this happen. Yeah. So death is part of life. That he was executed by. So just in general, death is familiar in the Old Testament.
Yeah. We'll wrap up. So we'll do one more, and then we'll wrap up this week. The part that kind of took note to me, and I think that's why I put 7 through 10 on there originally, is they went in there, stabbed him, and fled, Jonathan's son, Ishbosheth, and then they went back. That's the part that gets me. They went back. So it says they fled, and then they went back and cut off his head. It wasn't enough to kill him. There might have been fear at first because they knew that Saul had fallen, but they went back, cut off the head, and then so taking it, and then they take it to David, think they're going to get a reward for what they've done. Last section that we'll do today is we're just getting to the point where we talk about David anointed as king, and then we'll pause there, and then we'll run into, like I said, the last week. So 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 4, I'll do it. So then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and the King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. Let's pause there with that one. I just like how the people of Israel, the first time when they were asking for a king, and then God warned them, and then God was like, you're going to get a king, and this is what he's going to do to you. And then now they're like, David, you're the one. You're God's king, and we'll follow you. It's just interesting to me. It's interesting how their changes what they had.
I think it's interesting that people assume that David was the shepherd boy his entire life. David, the very reluctant shepherd boy, grew into a ruthless ruler, and you got to be sure you don't paint him with the shepherd boy paint. He was a ruthless ruler and got done what he needed to get done, whether we agree with it or not.
Yeah, that's starting right at the next week, talking about some of his victories. Going to go into it. He gets really, really. You see that, like I said, the many faces of David, and you see what he's capable of. And like I said, so next week will be the last week for this class, and then I think I don't remember. Mark's next after next week, and And then that next week is just going to be, like I said, so King David can't talk about. I don't think you can talk about David without at least talking about Bathsheba and that. And then wrapping up with David and his mighty men. That'll be the end of next week. Any last comments before we close out?
So, again, it's kind of like my point that I made last week, is that David's focus was on Saul was anointed. Saul was untouchable. God put Saul there. And David never felt like he had the right to remove Saul. He never felt like, if God put him there, I should take him down. He was told he was going to be king. He was told that Saul was going to be removed. But Saul still had this banner over him that says, this is God's anointed. Don't touch him. And David loved God so much that he was not willing to be violent, to be murderous, to advance himself, even protect himself against what God had put in place. I think that's where the saying that David was after God's own heart is. Other countries, it was tradition that if the king changed, lots of people died. Lots of people were killed, dragged out, murdered. This is what other countries did. This is what other nations did. David didn't want that for him because he was the next God's anointed. And what was going to happen to his family if this became the way that Israel changed kings? So he had such a different vision of how to change a king than what was normal in the time that he was not going to even protect himself from this king. And it's just a picture of how deeply David was into what God had planned for his nation.
So like I said, we'll wrap up here in a second. I genuinely appreciate the comments. I've been doing the studying of this for almost a couple months now, and I learned through some of these comments today more than I probably did in those couple months, just what some of the comments and the thoughts behind it. I appreciate it. It goes a long way, and it's something that I will take and go forward and kind of show some of people. And there's some people that I need to call, honestly, and be like, hey, I got some new information for I really want to talk to you about. Let's go to God in prayer, and then we'll wrap up. Lord, we thank you for another opportunity that you gave us to come together and meet in safety and in this building, in a controlled environment, and study your word and become closer to your knowledge and take these lessons that we're learning and go out and teach others and hopefully bring others to you. Lord, we ask now as we begin to prepare to worship you that we clear our minds of any worldly thoughts. And then we also ask, Lord, that everything that was said and done here today is done in a manner that's pleasing unto you and according to your will. We pray all these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.